Wonderful. We are here live at Art Laboratory Berlin, inside and outside. We have a virtual meeting, a reading group. In the series Permeable Bodies, I welcome the whole audience and the reading group and our guest, our dear guest, Julie Roberts, and together with artist Ewen Chardronnet, we are going through an interesting live stream reading group performance today. My name is Regina Rapp, and I welcome everyone also out there to the reading group Ultrasound. I give a tiny little introduction and I hand over to the artist Ewen Chardronnet later on. Then we're going to hear from Julie Roberts, and then later on we hear bits and literature excerpts from the reading group participants. So what we do today is the second part of a reading group series that is directly connected to the project Unborn 0x9, an art project by the artist Cheang and Ewen Chardronnet. So as I said, in context of our new series, Permeable Bodies, Art Laboratory Berlin launches a series of online reading groups as a fork-out project of Unborn 0x9, showing in the exhibition Matter of Flux, and the exhibition just closed the 9th of July. Initiated by Cheang and Ewen Chardronnet with Future Baby Production, the artwork Unborn 0x9 reflects on the techno-scientific developments in obstetrical medicine, its social, cultural, philosophical, and prospective implications, and to offer an artistic view of the science in the making. During the years 2021 and 22, Unborn 0x9 was part of the EU platform artformed.eu, which focuses on a methodological framework that fosters collaboration between artists, health, and biomedical researchers. The online reading group aims to enable cross-border knowledge exchange across nations, races, genders, real and virtual bodies maybe as well, for the studies in 3 specific topics: Ectogenesis, ultrasound, surrogacy. The online web platform incorporates reading materials, co-writing paths, and online chats as multiple interface entries. Guided by a leader with 10 registered readers, the online reading group aims for in-depth research studies and motivates public debate on these topics of concern. And the second online reading group that finishes today has an emphasis on ultrasound. And we have invited Dr. Julie Roberts as the leader of the ultrasound of the reading group. And let me just introduce Julie Roberts. Julie Roberts is a feminist interdisciplinary scholar with interests in reproductive politics, experiences of maternity care, and visual representations of pregnancy and birth. Julie Roberts is Senior Research Fellow at the Maternal Health and Wellbeing Research Group, School of Health Sciences, University of Nottingham in the UK, and author of The Visualized Fetus, a cultural and political analysis of ultrasound imagery, that appeared in 2012 and was reissued in Routledge in 2017. So before Julie Roberts will give us an introduction, I will hand over now to Ewen Chardronnet. And I thank everyone who is taking time here and outside. And we also would invite the audience, please, to listen critically and note questions and comments. We will later on also take those into consideration of the conversation. I mute myself, and now comes Ewen. Thank you so much.
Hello everybody. And thanks, Regine and the Art Laboratory Berlin for getting us together today in this mid-July break. Thanks, Julie and Matilda, Holly, Sally, Lucy for joining today, and really nice conversation all month. So I will introduce a little bit Unborn, but I will try to make it very short and just to revive a bit where we come from with this project. I will share a bit some slides coming from my keynote. Hope this is working well. Can you see? Can you see my?
Yes, we can.
Is it clear?
It is.
Yeah, okay. So the Unborn project has started already some time ago, back in 2016. I have, let's say, partly chief editor of a magazine, Makery.info, and also production for this company. And meanwhile, I also run my, let's say, personal more research project in art. And back then in 2016, working for Makery, which is a maker culture magazine, DIY, communities and art and science. So I encountered an initiative in Paris called EcoPen, ecopen.org. By then it was technology of ultrasound appeared to come on smartphones. So there were new devices appearing with companies such as Philips, with the Lumify or others, and but still very expensive technology. But I met this initiative at the Hôtel du Hospital in Paris, in France, where they started to ambition to develop an open science and affordable a small ultrasound device for smartphones called what they called echo stethoscope, because it is still a basic ultrasound imaging, but it can be used for, let's say, orientation of diagnostics. So their aim was to develop something that really goes below 1,000 euros, even lower, then could be accessible in many contexts, and also then training people in an open source dimension. So in various engineering and or medical schools all over the world, they could practice and start to develop their own tools, which is, of course, very interesting to my opinion at the time, that because it is really helping the access to healthcare. So I was really fascinated by the project, wrote several articles, and at some point in the discussions, they starting to propose me to actually, we're having a logic of open source community, so we would be very happy to welcome artists or media artists or ultrasound, or let's say electroacoustician, musician to join the community. So here you see a photo of the smartphone versus a photo of old ultrasound machine. So I contacted my friend Shuli Cheang and said, look, that's a really interesting perspective here. Let's start a project. And immediately Shuli came with this question of oh, wow, it's interesting. Let's question the cyborg baby ideas, following some ideas from the 90s, coined by Donna Haraway around the Cyborg Manifesto and so forth. And Shuli Cheang has a practice which is very well connected to the cyber feminist from that era, and always exploring science and science fiction connection to impact on contemporary society. So she suggested, like, let's first start to hack the device. So here was really like first prototyping, hacking the device. So we can made it not only a visual tool, but also an audio tool, some kind of become a musical instrument or audiovisual device by also converting from ultrasound to an audible spectrum. So we run a series of workshops, testing with musicians, artists, media artists, to test this audiovisual device using various softwares such as Pure Data or and then various open hardware to do conversion. Parallelly, we were also doing a lot of research on the various typologies of pregnancies, because we thought it was really important to, because, you know, ultrasound imaging can be used in various contexts, including, I don't know, heart attack, broken bones, but of course, the main users, the question of scanning pregnancies is of course important. And Makery organized a festival called Open Source Body. We decided to start a festival actually, and probably the project was instigator of the starting a festival. So we wanted to do focus groups, like encountering people, women, trans people, discussing their relation to giving birth to the child. And we did various focus groups, including working with NGOs such as Médecins du Monde, working with prostitution as well in Paris, or Gynecology Without Borders. And we made various anonymous reading focus groups, so people could express their relation to complicated relation to pregnancy. So you see here we made some categories and add collected testimonies that we will use then in sound art performances. So also here some image of installation. Meanwhile, we got interested into the ectogenesis question, because back in 2017 there was a first experiment on a baby lamb that was raised in an artificial womb. So that really questioned us on let's say Brave New World typology. Meanwhile, we also encounter the world of fetal phantoms, where a mannequin used in obstetricians schools or radiology schools to practice ultrasound imaging. So that's also quite a similar aesthetical dimension. And to do our own device, we had to go through the design of a fetal phantom to be able to actually also practice ourselves our own ACT device. So I will go fast. I prepared a long series of slides, but here you see we also had a lot of research on the literature that was precedent of Brave New World, started with many texts with Haldane. Back, we first coined the term ectogenesis in the early 20s, but a long philosophical debate in the 1920s in UK, including Dora Black. Here you see Mrs. Bertrand Russell, but we were advocating that ectogenesis could be actually freeing women from labor, and it goes actually to books from in the 70s, Shulamit Firestone. So I won't go too far there. Maybe a few images of where we ended up having this, science fiction inspired device that can also provoke a bit of the imaginaries. And the first reading group on ectogenesis was developing now we get to close to what's called now partial ectogenesis for premature, very early premature babies who could be transferred to artificial wombs. So that raised many questions that were discussed in the first group. This first reading group with Chloe Romanis was very interesting discussions. And so now I will pass the floor to Julie, so we can go deeply into the next group that was discussing ultrasound and its implications. Okay, Julie.
Oh, thank you, Evan. So the first thing I want to say is just to say thank you to Evan and Julie for inviting me to be part of this really fascinating project. It's been a real pleasure to bring together this diverse group of people to talk about one of my favorite topics for 4 weeks, which has been a real luxury. And it's been a really thought-provoking and stimulating 4 weeks. And I thought how I would start this conversation this evening is just to try and present quite briefly some of the key themes in my own work around ultrasound. And I'm going to read a few little snippets from my work. And it's been really wonderful to revisit those themes, but what I'm looking forward to most this evening is hearing from our readers and hearing what they have to say, because I know that you've each approached the reading list with your own kind of identities and experiences and interests. And I very much encourage you to do that. So I'm really interested to hear what you've come up with for this evening, for our last meeting, which is a shame. So let me just share my screen. I just have a couple of pictures just to share with you as I talk. Let's make sure that's working okay. It takes a moment. So are you seeing, it's gone black for me, but are you seeing 2D ultrasound for ultrasound images?
It just turned black.
It went black for you too, okay.
We had an image earlier.
It says end of slideshow, click to exit.
We had
Okay, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, can start at the beginning of the slideshow.
Okay, let's try. Sorry. Poor Evan has come off against my technical skills or lack of them several times over this month. Is that better?
Yes, we see it. Perfect.
Okay.
You have to go full screen.
Excellent.
We see it.
Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. Okay. So ultrasound is sometimes described as a window on the womb. And I think the problem with that metaphor is the sense of an unmediated, unconstructed view inside the pregnant body. So to state the obvious, we can't see the developing fetus with the naked eye. So ultrasound uses sound waves emitted from a transducer, and those sound waves differentially kind of bounce back from bone and tissue and fluid. And it's the data about how those sound waves move that's processed to produce an image like this. So the visualized fetus, as I've called it, is a cyborg. It's a hybrid of fleshy materiality and technology. And we can't have one without the other. So what we see isn't a neutral view from nowhere. To come back to Donna Haraway, what Donna Haraway calls the God trick, but it's a particular view made possible with this technology, but intertwined with history and politics, social and ethical issues. And what I really like about the art project that Evan presented is this bringing sound back into how we think about ultrasound. Ultrasound images didn't always look like this, of course. So if I take us back to 1954, Ian Donald was Professor of Midwifery at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And I'm going to read you a little bit about how he described his kind of first experiments with a view to introducing ultrasound into obstetrics. So in 1954, Ian Donald was the newly appointed Regius Professor of Midwifery at the University of Glasgow. He would remain in that post for 22 years, during which time he established the use of ultrasound in pregnancy. The story of Donald's discovery has been told frequently, but here's Donald's own account of his first experiment undertaken at Messrs. Babcock and Wilcox, a Glasgow-based company that built boilers for atomic power stations. So he writes, "I shall always remember that lovely sunny afternoon on the 21st of July, 1955, when we took down to the factory 2 cars with their boots loaded up with recently excised fibroids, small, large and calcified, and a huge ovarian cyst. The people in the factory had also supplied an enormous lump of steak by way of a control material. There then followed a series of fascinating experiments behind closed doors in their research department. We applied their ultrasonic probes directly to the various tissues and noted the types of echoes which appeared on their cathode ray screens. There were no facilities for photography, and the factory artist was called in to sketch the results. These were beyond my wildest dreams and clearly showed the difference between a fibroid and an ovarian cyst. This might sound laughable, but to me this was fundamental and exciting. I could see boundless possibilities in the years ahead." So Donald has this reputation as something of a sort of crazy inventor, and perhaps his account of that day plays up to that image. But this was the beginning of a long process of research and development. What Donald saw, the sight that prompted such enthusiasm, doesn't look much like the images that I'm showing you now. He was using an A-scope machine that displayed the ultrasonic echoes as a one-dimensional representation, a series of peaks and troughs. So really we're just seeing this kind of line. McNay and Fleming report an experiment to recreate what Donald would have seen that day, and they argue a lesser man than Donald might have gone no further. It's entirely to his credit that he withstood the ridicule of many of his colleagues who failed to see the potential of those early traces, they write. So, as they say, there's this long process of developing the technology and learning to see with it. Marjorie Marr is a nurse working with Donald, who we hear less about, but she began to use the machines to check for fetal presentation, so to see what position the fetus was in before the doctors came around. A series of standardized measures were created to assess gestational age, And by the early 70s, reports of identifying fetal anomalies using ultrasound appeared in scientific journals. But there was resistance from clinical colleagues who felt that they could already do what they needed to do, that they could use their hands, that they could palpate, and that they already had skills, and this was just an expensive sort of toy in a way. So you can read more about the history of ultrasound elsewhere, but we know that ultrasound has become routine in maternity care in many parts of the world. And what I guess I'm more interested in is how, alongside its clinical uses, how this technology might impact the experiences of pregnancy and also our kind of visual culture and our kind of broader ideas and politics. So I want to give you some examples of how the experience of pregnancy might change with the routine use of this technology, and you'll be able to think of others, I'm sure. But historian Barbara Duden writes about how quickening, so that's the sensation of feeling the fetus move in your own uterus, used to mark the beginning of pregnancy. And now, she argues, we experience a technological quickening. That's to say that pregnancy starts to seem real, perhaps is only real when we see our fetus on the screen. For women in the UK, that usually happens around 12 weeks when they have their first kind of routine scan within the National Health Service. So ultrasound dating has replaced last menstrual period as a mean of dating pregnancy and is used to calculate an estimated due date. And we've been reading a little bit around women's experiences when they dispute this technologically mediated dating, if their embodied knowledge tells them something different from what the measurements tell them, and also how that can have knock-on impacts for decision making, perhaps towards the end of pregnancy when there are decisions to make about induction, for example. And ultrasound screening produces new dilemmas for parents who might receive information about health conditions or disabilities before a baby's born. And often there aren't very many medical interventions that can be offered. Crucially, I think ultrasound images the fetus as a separate being, and the connection with an expectant parent is obscured. So we've been reading an autobiographical piece, one of several, by Sharon Lerner, called My Womb, the Mosh Pit, in which she grapples with her experience of seeing her own baby on the screen in dialogue with the feminist literature on ultrasound. And I just want to read a little bit from that. So she writes, Hubbard, Phelan and Duden, among others, point out that the free-floating image of the fetus in the sonogram erases the body of the woman. In other words, the sonogram takes a picture of me that I'm not in. Even in the examination room, I don't really exist. The moment when all eyes turn away from my belly and towards the monitor. For the fetus to be seen as an individual, the woman must drop out of the picture. I find looking at the fetus in my body to be unbelievably pleasurable. Although image and self-image are inextricable, feminist film critics tell us this much: the danger and pleasure of dropping out of one's own picture should not be underestimated. I bonded with an image, I aborted an image, and I deeply mourn an image. I just find that so powerful and complex, and there's so much going on there, and I think we might come back to some of those themes. But so in a way, ultrasound is offering us a baby's first picture, which is incidentally the title of Lisa Mitchell's monograph on this topic. And we can share that picture with family, perhaps with complete strangers. We can pin it to the fridge door, add it to the baby book, or as in Lena's case, mourn it. And certain compositions are prized over others. So if we've got these 4 different images on the screen at the moment, and the one on it's my top right is kind of the closest, I would say, to the typical image that you might see. It's got that nice, clear kind of side profile. This is the kind of image that is often looked for in the image to take home when a scan is done. It's the sort of classic view that you'll see in popular culture, and I'll talk about some examples of that. Whereas perhaps this one at the bottom left, I think it's the back view of the fetus, and you can see the spine quite clearly. that's less likely to be baby's first picture. And actually the views that sonographers need in order to measure, in order to do their tasks of assessing the growth and the health of the fetus are not necessarily the ones that families take home with them. This type of image is probably really familiar to you, whether you've been pregnant or not. And it's quite quickly that as ultrasound becomes routine in obstetric medicine, that the images also start to travel beyond the clinic. So in 1984, grainy black and white imagery had a starring role in the anti-abortion film The Silent Scream. And we found in our reading group that we kept returning to issues around the role that ultrasound practice and images play in reproductive politics in our different national contexts. But one of the first images to pique my interest in this topic was ostensibly nothing to do with abortion. Rather, it was an advert for Volvo cars, reproduced in a journal article by the anthropologist Janelle Taylor. So her article, The Public Fetus and the Family Car, begins with the words, "Not long ago, a fetus tried to sell me a car, or should I say a car tried to sell me a fetus. In any case, I don't buy it." So this is one of those early pieces that really kind of piqued my interest. And I'm going to read again just half a page from my book where I talk about that. So having read Taylor's article, I began to see fetuses everywhere. On band t-shirts, print and television advertisements. On one level, the diversity of fetal appearances in popular culture points to the flexibility of the fetus as a semiotic object, as a sign able to signify multiple connotations. However, Taylor argues that the car advertisement works within a particular logic, a culturally specific understanding of fetal images. A large sonogram is captioned with the question, "Is something inside telling you to buy a Volvo?" The advertisement draws on Volvo's reputation for safety. Taylor argues the sonogram only makes sense in this context because of our familiarity with the image within the context of anti-abortion campaigns. The fetal image is instantly recognizable as a signifier of children, endangerment, and the need for protection. While traveling on the London Underground one day, my eyes were drawn to the advertising boards above the heads of my fellow passengers. There I saw a familiar image, a sonogram, the fetus in profile, markers of technical measurements down the left-hand side. It took a second glance before I realised that this fetus was working out, lifting dumbbells inside the womb. The caption informed me, "Pregnacare helps give babies a strong, healthy start." So this advertisement for vitamins works with a similar equation of fetuses with infants and with the notion that the fetus needs protection from a responsible adult, in this case, the mother-to-be who will consume their daily vitamins. I think it also shows just how radically you can alter one of these pictures and for it still to be recognizable, that we can actually, add in some little dumbbells into this picture and it still kind of carries that weight of a kind of semi-medical image, and we can still read it really, as an ultrasound, as a baby. So I want to warn you on the basis of that story that once you start to see public fetal images, you may not be able to stop. And I first encountered 3D ultrasound. So moving on to a different evolution of this technology. So I first encountered one of these pictures in the wild, as it were, on an EasyJet flight to Poland. And it was in an advert for Philips. It was part of their Sense and Sensibility campaign, and it's a description of that advert that actually opens my book. So I'm sorry I don't have it to show you in its original form, but hopefully the description will conjure it up for you. So a huge sepia portrait of a fetus occupies the central frame of the advert. Vertical, it faces the camera, eyes closed, a faint smile on its lips. The black edges of the picture drape either side like theatre curtains. The three-dimensional fetus is making its debut. In contrast, the ultrasound machine appears tiny in a square inset in the bottom right-hand corner. The screen is blank, the machine inactive. It sits in a wide empty space on a white and grey background. The caption in small grey letters beneath the picture reads, "Because babies don't come in 2 dimensions." Philip's 3D ultrasound. Ultrasound images that are more like life itself, 3-dimensional and in real time. A true innovation that allows doctors to see things as they really are. It's a case of technology imitating life. It just makes sense. So then we very much have this sense of, you know, a window, a kind of a view from nowhere. This is how things really are inside the body. There are no kind of, as if there are no decisions here about what color or how, you know, how to edit the picture or which way up or these kind of things. And fascinating that it ends up in an in-flight magazine, and you might wonder why they're advertising this to a sort of public audience rather than a medical one, but it was part of a campaign, including television, print, online and billboard advertisements, and covering a range of products from medical devices like this one to much more domestic things like televisions and DVD recorders and electric toothbrushes. And so it's sort of using 3D ultrasound as a symbol of technological advancement and uncomplicated technology. So it relies on this idea of simplicity of the product, that it's sort of self-evident, easily understood by everyone, and just makes sense. And I suppose just to some of the early kind of feminist work tried to undermine this rhetoric by looking at how that image comes to be, look how it does, it's kind of, and looking at how it's constructed. I've tried to do the same with 3D to see if those same kind of techniques work. So 3D is using the same kind of sound waves as before, but it's taking a sort of series of cross sections and reconstructing them using an algorithm into this kind of 3D view, and we can kind of turn it and flip it and edit it in various ways. And we see a similar kind of story in the literature about sort of slow, interesting clinical circles being quite slow to build in terms of what it might be useful for. But it has been taken up quite enthusiastically in the private sector. So in the mid-2000s, I conducted fieldwork in the UK in what were then quite newly established studios offering what they call bonding scans. So there were 3 or 4D scans, so 4D meaning 3D but moving, so the picture is updated rapidly, for non-diagnostic purposes. So it was about coming and just looking and maybe finding out the sex, but maybe beginning the sort of bonding process with the new baby who was joining the family and taking home souvenir pictures, sometimes other products too. And these services were able to come about as the equipment reduced in size. So once it could fit in the boot of a car, it could be transported to a hired room somewhere in the city to offer these kind of scans on a commercial basis. So it's been really interesting to think about Ewen's Echo Pen and the kind of, you know, reduction in scale again. So I was lucky enough to be able to be in the room and see how these scans worked. And again, I kind of wanted to see how those images became meaningful for non-clinical information and for non-clinically trained audiences. So again, I'm going to read you just a little bit of my observations in the scan room. So the lights are dimmed and a big, expensive looking screen glows on the wall. The sonographer settles the pregnant woman on the couch with her abdomen exposed and covers her clothes with a towel before applying the transducing gel. Her partner, if present, or sometimes her mother, is encouraged to sit in the chair next to her. Another guest can be settled on the sofa. The sonographer sits in front of the machine, looking at her own smaller screen with her back to the screen on the wall. Working in black and white 2D at first, the sonographer takes a sweeping look at the fetus and begins to point out key landmarks to the clients. The heartbeat is almost always the first thing pointed out. There's a strong heartbeat there, look. So there's that reassurance straight away. The baby's lying on its tummy, feet over this side, head over there. The sonographer might point out other internal organs or the spine. If the clients want to know the sex of the baby, or if they want to confirm it, then that's done next, all in 2D. Looking right between the legs there, looks like a girl. Then the sonographer begins to work to find the best angle for the transducer, and when she has a clear view of the face with plenty of fluid around, changes to 4D in a flick of a switch. The sonographer starts recording and guides the clients around the screen. This is a shoulder, elbow, the arms bent up here, the face turned away from us into the placenta. The identification of limbs and face helps expectant parents get their bearings in the screen space. And these kind of descriptions might range from matter of fact, labeling, like as I've described, or more imaginative annotations, including acting out the pose of the fetus. So they might be kind of showing different actions. The clients soon begin to learn their way around the screen and to take a more active role in coding the imagery on the screen. Hesitantly at first, is that a foot? Then becoming more confident, look, you can see his little mouth moving. The participation of the pregnant woman and family members is necessary to making the narration more personalised. The sonogram is annotated in such a way as to make it both socially and personally meaningful. That's to say that sonographers can actively construct the visualised fetus as a baby, drawing on visible markers of personhood and generic ideals of cuteness. But family members can make more specific connections with family identity and history, annotating familiar facial features and behaviours, and weaving the fetus into a network of kinship relations. These are Mitchell's terms. So it's been really fascinating to watch what I've called this collaborative coding process of the image on the screen. And it's reinforced to me the relevance of social context to our interpretations and the work that has to go into making ultrasound imagery meaningful. And this kind of dialogue also provides resources for sonographers to smooth the interaction when perhaps the imaging wasn't going so well. When it's difficult to get a clear view of the face, the fetus might be described as shy or cheeky. And we've talked a bit about placentas over the last month, fascinating structures that connect mother and fetus, but which in the context of 3D scans are often seen as obstructions to a sort of desired view. And with this technology, as I've tried to say, that the image can be manipulated and the placenta digitally cut away to achieve the sort of fetal portrait that we're looking for, a very visceral representation, it seems to me, of the imaging of the fetus as separate from the person who's pregnant. So I think I've tried to kind of weave my way through lots of the themes that we've talked about. I think that's enough for me. And I think we can hear from our readers. Evan, are you going to introduce who's going to go first? Okay, maybe, oh, you're there.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I think Holly and Matilda has worked together, but Holly will go first, I've understood.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Julie. That was great. That was a good overview. And I feel like I might repeat a couple of things that you said, but with maybe some added insights. And yeah, I'd maybe quickly like to thank Art Laboratory Berlin and Evan for their work on this, but particularly Julie for all of her recommendations and organizations, for constantly being on the web chat. It took a lot of work, I think, and work is what I'm going to talk about, and the different kinds of work that take place in the commercial ultrasound clinic in particular. And I've written something which I'm going to read, and I think it's about 10 minutes, but stop me if I'm going on for too long. And the stuff that I've written is in part influenced by a series of ethnographic visits to commercial 4D ultrasound clinics in London, like the ones that Julie mentioned, with my supervisor Helen during her pregnancy last summer. Okay, so I've split my ideas on work and ultrasound into 4. One is the different kinds of work that take place in the commercial ultrasound clinic, what I term workflows. 2, focusing specifically on the work of the mother or pregnant person, so gestational labor, and asking whether or not ultrasound obscures or reveals gestational labor. 3, the tensions between an active and passive gestator in the clinic, particularly if we position the technology against the backdrop of neoliberalism. And 4, what is actually being sold in the commercial ultrasound clinic. So rather than reading from one of the set texts, I'll use ideas from a few of them throughout, drawing particularly on those in the section of set readings on commercializing ultrasound, so the stuff that Julie mentioned towards the end of her presentation. So 1, the workflows of the commercial ultrasound clinic. In her article, Wakey Wakey Baby on 4D bonding scans, Julie writes that despite the greater clarity of 3 and 4D ultrasound for a lay audience, the images produced are not fixed. Rather, their meaning is fluid and multiple. This meaning is constructed by a number of actors in the space. The first and most obvious is the sonographer, whose labor is multifaceted, particularly in the commercial clinic. Firstly, there is what we might call clinical labor, after Melinda Cooper and Catherine Waldby. That is the medical skill of the sonographer. This clinical labor is made visible through the initial focus on diagnostic measurements in the 2D scan before moving on to the bonding 3D scan. So emphasis is placed on explaining numerical data, stressing the medical expertise of the sonographer. We also found that it was signified in dress, so medical outfits, sort of scrubs and nurse kits, which weren't worn in all the clinics, sort of suggesting that they might not actually be necessary and were part of some kind of performance. So alongside this clinical labor, that is the actual scanning, is what Julie describes in her research as discursive work. That is how the sonographer narrativizes and manages poor visualization. Julie writes, discursive work is required to map the distant and massively enlarged image onto the pregnant body. And I'm also interested in how what Ewen was showing on the iPhone or smartphones is sort of changing that. This enlarged image is then shrunk down and what that does. Maybe we can talk about that later. Okay, so discursive work. So Lisa Mitchell refers to this as translation. Mitchell argues that the sonographer's role is to translate ultrasound into meaningful clinical data, percentages, numbers, statements of normality and abnormality, but also into socially meaningful data about maternal and fetal selfhood. So this brings us to emotional work, which is another kind of work that Julie refers to, and that which Janelle Taylor describes as care work. This might include disclosing potentially upsetting diagnostic information acquired from the ultrasound and offering the suitable level of comfort, or the work of framing the experience to the consumer as enjoyable and a bonding experience. This emotional work of creating the experience of bonding is defined by Julie as collaborative coding, quote, in which sonographers and expectant parents work together to narrate the 3/4D scan imagery produced during a bonding scan. This also includes the work that goes into family creation through the ultrasound image, which I would argue is socially reproductive work, which I'll talk about in a second. So as Julie, Frances Griffiths, and Alice Varan show in another paper we read, family members can rehearse their roles in the clinic room. This, I would argue, is the work of doing family. And there's maybe more to be said here on the difference between the NHS and the commercial clinic, at least in England, in the UK. So I've highlighted clinical labor, discursive work, emotional labor or care work, collaborative coding, and the socially reproductive work of doing family. Other kinds of workplace that take place in and around the clinic include the work of the receptionist, fostering the spa-like atmosphere of the clinics we visited, the waste removal man who came in during one of our appointments, the clerical work, but also the labor of those in developing countries assembling components. The list could go on. Okay, 2, gestational labor. Next, I want to draw our attention to the work of the pregnant person, what Sophie Lewis terms gestational labor. Lewis writes in the Marxist feminist tradition of social reproduction theory. Social reproduction theory explores the ways in which the daily and generational renewal of human life is essential to capitalism. This includes particular activities such as childcare, cleaning, and cooking that contribute to the successful reproduction and maintenance of the workforce. Through this framework, pregnancy can be theorized as work, that is, gestational labor. Crucially, this kind of socially reproductive work is often obscured as work and framed as something natural, an act of love or biological destiny, something women are innately good at. Another thing to note is that in the last few decades, socially reproductive activities have become increasingly mediated by the market, e.g. the hiring of nannies, cleaners, etc. And pregnancy has also become increasingly market mediated, thanks in part to the growth of the reproductive technologies industry. So we can understand pregnancy as a form of work. The pregnant person in the commercial ultrasound clinic contributing to the workflows that take place, not just discursively, but also gestationally. I want to ask then whether the practice of fetal ultrasound reveals or obscures gestational labor. Does ultrasound show the process, the activity of pregnancy, or does it exclusively show the fetus? Historically, the answer has been the latter, as Julie spoke about already, and as feminists that we read in our group, Pachesky, Haraway, and others have shown. So fetal ultrasound positions the woman's body as a passive container. It is active and given personhood. In this way, it would seem that the ultrasound was gestational labor. Reading Group discussed what the placenta represents in these scans. In commercial clinics, the placenta was often visible in the ultrasounds. Frequently, this was framed as maternal obstruction to the clear image of the fetus. So I guess carrying on from Julie, does the placenta represent the mother and therefore the activity, the work of pregnancy, or does it belong to the fetus, or is it shared? And what does this do to our understandings of gestational labor? 3, so in active and passive tensions. So in these historical feminist texts on ultrasound, the woman's body is framed as passive. However, in these commercial clinics, I think something more complicated is taking place. Commercial ultrasound practices reinforce neoliberal capitalism's illusion of personhood, maternal, and familial responsibility. The pregnant body is rendered a passive container for the baby, an empty womb waiting to be filled with a fetus. Yet, commercial ultrasound practices sell an intervention into gestation that encourages maternal responsibility in the form of maternal bonding. The practice erodes the distinction between prenatal and postnatal development and encourages parents to start acting as good parents before the baby is even born, evidence of how capitalism has entered the reproductive body. In her work on ultrasound as an effective technology, Jennifer Dembo found that optimal bonding reflects the norms of intensive mothering. So is maternal passivity problematized by the position of the mother as a consumer? I think there are divergent notions of responsibility and passivity taking place. 4, commodification, what is being sold? So what is being sold at the clinic? So far from what I've presented, what seems to be sold at the commercial 3D ultrasound clinic is primarily the experience of maternal bonding, a service. But in reality, what was being sold in our experience was a physical product. It was not so much meet my baby, but more get my commodity. In our visits, the sonographer was seeking the perfect image of the fetus. What the clinic was selling and would continue to sell after the scan was over was this image in the form of mugs, key rings, professionally printed photographs, or whatever. It felt less experiential, less about bonding in this way, and more about the image that we were going to take away with us. And Julie touched on the fact that they can be edited. So the placenta getting in the way can be taken out to sort of produce a better image to go on your mug or your key ring or whatever it is. Perhaps this chimes with Julie when she writes, the fetus is constructed more and more as a commodity, and maybe rings true with the idea of the fetus being used to sell the Volvo or the Philips technology suite or whatever it is. So to end, I'd like to raise 3 questions based on what I presented. 1, does ultrasound make visible the process of gestating and the activity of pregnancy, or only the fetus? And maybe drawing on the stuff we've discussed about placentas. 2, by extension, does ultrasound obscure or reveal gestational labor? And 3, what is being sold in the commercial ultrasound clinic? A service, a commodity, maybe how this differs to the NHS or other forms of public healthcare. And now I will pass on to Matilda, who's going to talk about authorship. And we've sort of been discussing these ideas between us. Thank you.
Okay, so do I go straight from here? Right. So yes, I was in the idea to discuss the notion of authorship. I was partly inspired by my own scholarship in cinema studies, film studies, art studies, visual art studies, partly by Sophie Lewis, that was mentioned by Holly just now, and mostly in the context of our reading group, by the Donna Haraway reflection in the text Virtual Speculum in the New World Order. And the starting point for this text was the feminist cartoon, which I wanted to show, but I don't really think it exists somewhere outside of Donna Haraway's text, so I just have to describe it. I mean, online, obviously it exists somewhere, but not online. It's a cartoon by Anne Kelly presenting a naked woman body positioned against a computer monitor displaying an image of a fetus in a way that relates both to ultrasound screening and to Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel fresco creation of Adam. Donna Haraway's text is a little bit overwhelming in terms of how many, for example, in terms of how many interpretations, possible interpretations of this cartoon it gives. And I will not be able to sum up all of them, but I will just quote a little bit, a tiny bit. So now quoting from Haraway, Kelly's cartoon is not denunciatory. I do not see it, and I do not see in it any stereotyped position on new reproductive technologies or pure certainty about supposed alienation and disembodiment. So, like, summing this up, Haraway is now criticizing this idea that ultrasound technology, which is obviously kind of portrayed in this cartoon, disembodied or alienate the pregnant person. Nor is Kelly's cartoon celebratory. It does not reflect credit of the original. It does not announce a new scientific age in the image of an original creation. The cartoon depends on signifiers of information and communication technologies. So that's one. And there's one of the very many interpretations that was of this cartoon by Haraway that was most interesting for me. So I'm quoting again. On the other hand, the female Adam has her hand on the keypad. She seems to be in the position of the author. Then the fetus is her file, which is writing, editing, or as one viewer suggested, deleting. Certainly, the politics of abortion are implicit in this cartoon. Maybe she's reaching the escape key, or perhaps merely the control key. So we are going from this notion of being subjected to medical technologies that are disembodying and alienating to the idea of being an author of one's own, if not the pregnancy itself, then at least of the image, of the ultrasound image that we kind of co-create. So my questions would be, how can gestational labor, to use the term that Holly used by Sophie Lewis, and pregnancy be discussed with relation to authorship? Is the notion of authorship potentially productive in terms of regaining agency by a pregnant person with relation to their body, to the technology, and to the social context in which the pregnancy takes place? And finally, what is the role of the ultrasound within the pregnancy authorship? So first thing is that the notion of authorship is problematic in itself, because it's like positively associated with agency, creativity, art, and originality. But it can also be criticized as contributing to this very neoliberal notions of patents and rights and the different modes of power the author exerts over himself, as is traditional as he, over his work, often referred to as a god within the world he creates. And this reference this is the reference that can be traced back to both Donna Haraway and to the Sistine Chapel, and over the public that admires his genius and his craftsmanship. Recognizing this, we probably need to address the question of feminist authorship that would allow to regain agency, but will not necessarily be a repetition of the said well-established views. It is also addressed by Sophie Lewis with regard to the culturally dominating notion of biological family that exerts its power over the individual family members. So now going into this problem of authorship in pregnancy. It does intersect with this idea of authorship generally. Sophie Lewis is writing, I'm quoting now, our self-image as authors who exert control over their work, even that we have this self-image as authors. Even Marxists, writes Sophie Lewis, who in theory know better, would prefer to feel they have the upper hand over the labor process. Politically unsettling as it may be, however, it does appear that the labor does us. By stating this, Lewis demystifies the idea that by rejecting such factors as technology or medicalization in pregnancy, the pregnant person would be able to perceive themselves as those in control of their minds, uteruses, fetuses, and the future babies. Lewis also recalls Maggie Nelson and Samantha Hunt, quote, I'm quoting, like me, Nelson rejects this distinction between reproductive technology and natural pregnancy and between the two alienations they represent. For Samantha Hunt, too, the point is that gestational biology is already a hostile takeover. And I'm quoting again from Samantha Hunt by Sophie Lewis, I'm ruled by elixirs and compounds I don't even know. So that's the pregnancy as a situation that culturally kind of signifies the losing of control and being subjected to powers that we don't understand, and they are always also culturally mediated. And I will say that this is exactly the feeling of losing control, so intrinsic to the experience of pregnancy, that causes this need for agency, which can be acquired in many different ways. Medicalization, surveillance, and scientific supervision can certainly be some of the ways, but as it's been many times proved by feminist scholars, these are the risky ways, especially within a patriarchal and capitalist society with a managerial approach to organize the population. Following the religious path might be another approach, even more problematic with regards to contemporary needs, models of personhood, or sensitivities. Hence, my question would be if the approach in which both the gestational labor and its outcome might be described in the language of art and creativity with their notion of authorship, that simultaneously gives the agency and avoids certain traps of medicalized, natural, or religious view of pregnancy. Saying this, we need to remember about the perspective in which authorship is always the co-authorship, and the result, as Sophie Lewis stated, and the result we strive for is not the total control, but the way to both regain this control and to deal with the fact of losing it. This is the way I interpret the Joanna Rajkowska's Polish artist project Born in Berlin, which I mentioned within our discussion on PAD, our discussions on PAD within the last month. Through the means of art, Rajkowska turns her pregnancy, the birth of her daughter, and the child's subsequent sickness into art that is not identical with life, but has many connections to it, both in the positive and negative way. While pregnant, Rajkowska creates a certain personality for her future child, Rosa, but she does not force her real-life daughter to assume it. This way, she can stay active in her pregnancy and consciously perform the gestational labor, but in the same time, she does not perceive herself as omnipotent or all-controlling, as she also deals with the dimensions of motherhood that she neither controls nor fully accepts. And now, the last bit of this presentation is about authorship and the ultrasound specifically. In her presentation, Holly problematized ultrasound with relation to work, and she showed how the female body was traditionally, and it's actually really hard to discuss with it, presented as passive within ultrasound examination. And also how the pregnant person in especially medical, strictly medical, not bonding situation has to listen, has no discursive power over the situation. She has to listen to the verdict that is given by a doctor, by a person in charge. However, as Cheang and Bainon-Jones states in her text, Revisioning Ultrasound Through Women's Accounts of Pre-Abortion Care in England. This was one of the texts that we read during our reading group meetings. The dominant representation of ultrasound in feminist texts should be deconstructed. Women who wish to terminate or those who are likely to suffer miscarriage can psychologically benefit from the ultrasound technology, while often subverting the common view of it. The process, the work of imagining the fetus is part of the very national gestational work from before the introduction of the ultrasound. And the pleasurable aspects of scans seem to be connected to the possibility of encountering the image of the effect of one gestational work with or without the aid of medical personnel. And here comes all this hacking or biohacking dimension that I'm not going to elaborate on, but is obviously present within our discussions. This image that we receive can be differently interpreted by different women as a present child, a future child, the child that I'm not going to have, or some other entity that can be named, dealt with, acknowledged, regardless of the outcome of the given pregnancy. Most likely contributing to establishing some kind of fetal personhood, not necessarily the human one, ultrasound technology might be less determining than we are accustomed to think. And I think it can contribute to the more authorial and creative way of thinking of one's pregnancy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matilda. So it's 7:07, and I will now, regarding time, I will now give the floor to Sally. She prepared also a performative video reading. So Sally, maybe you can shortly introduce it, and then I will play it.
Hi everybody. It's lovely to see you all in person. Yeah, the video is a little bit longer than I anticipated, so apologies. There was so much to get into and so much to look at, and I've narrowed it down to visual images, really, starting with looking for visual images in film and cinema and television of ultrasound use and then medicalized pregnancy. And it's gone on from there. Yeah, I've used a lot of repetition in the video, and I think that has a deliberate impact, and it's probably best to discuss it afterwards, if that's okay. You can see if we go from there.
Yeah, I know.
They are working notes. I've just used it as a video. It's how I work visually. So they're my working notes. Edited up.
Do you see it well?
Hello, good evening and welcome to the Atelier Mélusine in sunny southwest France. It's a great honour to be here this evening with Ultrasound X09 in the wonderful Berlin Art Lab. Thank you to Ewen and the team, and especially to Julie and my wonderful co-readers on the reading panel. The discussions have been absolutely fascinating and the reading material extraordinary, and it's been both enlightening and interesting and humbling to be part of such a great team of women with so much knowledge on the subject. I'm an artist. I have no scientific or medical qualifications, but I do have experiential knowledge. Ultrasound has helped save my life. I have stage 4 endometriosis, and especially intravaginal ultrasound was the most helpful diagnostic tool in sourcing tumours and locating them for surgery. I've also had to have uterine evacuations to remove dead feti, and this without a doubt has been a critical diagnostic and surgical aid, diagnostic tool and surgical aid. Personally, during pregnancy, I found, for me, it really operated as proof that there was something there. I was very ill during all 3 of my full-term pregnancies with awful morning sickness and breathing difficulties, and the babies in the first trimesters felt like poisonous parasites. I'm rhesus negative, so my body fights any onboard passengers, and I have to have anti-D shots as the baby is born, and in the case of any miscarriages. I've also attended late 4D scans, as they were then called, and they seemed alarmingly accurate visually and facially. But by this stage of the pregnancy, unless a very serious health problem is flagged up, the baby's coming. And I found that the choice to abort imperfect feti is generally hugely personal, political, and romanticized in often the tragic sense in popular culture, as are most techno-medical or sci-fi based narratives. Additional texts that I've been looking at for this presentation are Form, Function, Perception and Reception, Visual Bioethics and the Artificial Womb by E.B.S. Kendall, published by Yale J. Biomed in September 22. And then the much older Fetal Images, The Power of Visual Culture in the Politics of Reproduction by Rosalind Pollock-Petetsky, Feminist Studies, Volume 3, and that's 1987, so a way back. I think I'd like to open with a quote from the first text, which is Bioethics, Form and Function, Perception and Reception. And the quote is, "From their earliest use in prenatal care, ultrasound images of the fetus in utero have been weaponized by anti-choice groups in an attempt to establish the fetus as an independent subject, demanding protection." Lauritsen calls attention to the 1984 anti-abortion film, The Silent Scream, as a particularly potent example of this, although his analysis has been criticized by some for focusing more on the narration than on the images he claims to be primarily interested in. The text continues, "In reference to this film, Rosalind Petetsky notes that the anti-abortion debate in the United States during the 1980s were heavily dependent on mass culture and imagery, drawing parallels between the rights of infants and fetuses based solely on their visual. The same text continues, quoting Suzanne Anker and Sarah Franklin, noting that just because an entity may look like something else does not mean there is any moral relevance to this resemblance. But actually notes ultrasound pictures are also inherently misleading, framed in such a way as erases the pregnant person's body and perpetuates the myth of the fetus as primary and autonomous. And I think many of my co-speakers will address this and have addressed, and the text address this particular point. But this is the only thing that makes the victim as fetus narrative of films or documentaries, such as The Silent Scream, possible. And Catherine Wood explains that women may be custodians of the image, but the mother's body is absent in the representation of the seemingly disembodied fetus floating in space, suggesting that an independent person capable of a separate existence, which is clearly not the case. This counters the symbiotic relationship between mother and child, which is a feature of earlier non-visual experiences based on feeling rather than seeing, and continues again that the idea of autopic authority mentioned before and the privileging of visual media over other forms of evidence. Bjorn Farquhar notes that this manipulated image, the fetal astronaut, whilst arising from medical technology, is disseminated by popular media. And this fetal astronaut has been an ongoing description from the text from the 1980s. The result of promoting the visualization of the fetus as a separate entity in pregnancy and this creation of a second independent subject whose interests can conflict with the first. Likewise, a lack of fetal personhood, whether legal, moral, or both, can afford no such protections. The flow of images between medical and popular culture, as Treckler and Cartwright and et al., 1998, make clear, is multidirectional, that science and medicine provide the raw material for popular narratives and spectacles, to the same extent that medicine borrows the representational norms of popular culture. In our discussions, the point of the image or ultrasound image becoming the main message, allowing its context to then be repurposed at will by various actors and invested parties, and more distance from the original subject object is important. The actual physicality of the image, the grayscale, makes it otherworldly and temporarily vague too. It is almost a ghost image and echoes back to the black and white is very evocative and echoes back to referential or traditional values emerging from a tradition or a medical tradition with gravitas, as well as being deliberately vague. Matilda made the point very clearly that X-ray images and ultrasound images have strong symbolic meaning outside medicine, more so possibly than any other medical images. And it is interesting to see how ultrasound borrows from the representational norms of popular culture, which could be unpacked much further. I think the only image that can compete culturally with a fetal image is that X-ray image of a skeleton, and both of them have already got the symbolic meaning outside medicinal or medical scientific practices. Also, in some cases, both represent death, although this has been flipped with the scans of the unborn child to represent life, hope, marvels, miracles. But clearly the fetus and the skeleton outside the living host or body both represent death. Ultrasound too is an important tool in lots of television and film. It's a device for plot being moved along, as well as symbolically and emotionally. X-ray and cinema were officially invented or discovered in the same year, which is 1895, and some of the earliest films played with the recently invented X-ray technology. It can also have conscious level as well as the technological, as it's a way of seeing things that are not possible to be seen with the human eye. Previously, women have had the power of translating or interpreting these invisible things. Yoshichar's book Possession is particularly interesting to me because it's an analytical example of women taking back social power through unseen methodologies, or the unseen, or potentially magical, yet conforming to social norms through their lived or possessed experience. This ultrasound removes some of this potential personal and internal lived experience, translating into voice. In cinema, there's an enormous tradition of gynae horror. At the end of the text, there's a comprehensive list to highly standard mainstream sites and films which focus on this subject, which comes in a wider context of medical drama and medical film, very well known. But the gynae horror or genres fall into two main categories. The first being the need to save the baby, generally a narrative of surprise and unwanted or difficult pregnancy. The underlying theme is the priority of saving the baby versus the harm, either social, psychological, financial, as well as physical, caused to the mother. There is also a heavily biased subgenre of docusuasion films here, such as The Silent Scream, which is so well documented, which promotes a very pro-fetus, anti-female discourse. And whether pro or anti-abortion, these documentaries rely heavily on medical and ultrasound images to progress their ideologies. I think it must be acknowledged that every woman's relationship to her own femininity is different, and mine has not been an easy one. The portrayal of pregnancy in films also highlights the values attached to female reproduction, and some of my concerns lie deeply around its commodifications and the ethics connected to it, especially for poor women and families who then may apply pressure on them either to abort or to keep the child, or in some cases, keep it and then sell it. Most of these films do not prioritize the women clearly over that of the child or fetus, which to me as a living autonomous human who's had 12 pregnancies, only 3 of which have reached full term, is a horrendous and terrifying thought. It is only luck that I live in a society which has prioritized me with instant, unquestioned medical care for free. Other films raise concerns of poverty, social coercion, and long-term suppression of women very clearly. In each case, the scan is the red flag for joy or grief in the cinematic world. It is the moment, perhaps, that the pregnancy becomes real for everyone outside the mother. And I wonder how many proposals of marriage have taken place post-scan and post-picture, and whether there's part of a very deep psychological fear that I know most men have that the child may not be theirs, which can also then be verified by genetic testing now. The film use of scan does what I felt it did, proves that there's something there, and the attachment placed on that is then driven by the personal, individual, and collective choices and situation available. I cannot disconnect healthcare, especially maternity care, from poverty and politics. I'm also aware that my experience is not that of every woman. The second scenario or case is the alien or demon baby. From Rosemary's Baby, Total Recall to the Twilight sagas, hugely mainstream is the trope of the demon, alien, or mutant baby. Again, they seem to be allowed or even encouraged to come full term. Bella's birth scene in the Twilight sagas is possibly one of the most abusive and horrendous ideological descriptions of birth and pregnancy ever. There is always this fantasy meme that aborting the fetus will somehow kill the mother. But again, this is always a magical and unreal theme. Even in the most famous Alien series, notably when an alien bursts from the chest of a man, but more so when the female protagonist hurls herself into the furnace with the great demon mother alien, as the young alien rips its way out of her chest. This represents the surrogate mother giving her life as the infant is born and sacrificed to save humanity. Is this what women are expected to do? The ultrasound device allows mankind to try and peek inside this magical realm where birth and death ride hand in hand, the womb of woman, but has also hugely reinforced the idea that the fetus has an equal life to the mother, and that the mother can and possibly should sacrifice everything if need be to bring it into the world. Other pregnancy-based film genres include fertility and infertility films, which are tragedies. The horrors of IVF being yet another medical advance I sometimes question, despite having personally donated my womb and tumours and endometrial matter to the John Redcliffe Medical Hospital, where my cells have no doubt been used to advance the field. Surrogacy and adoption, both of which unfold some sort of hero's journey trope with romanticised tragedy, and comedy in the most mainstream film, Junior with Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger, where the Terminator becomes the first man to have a baby. There are also a burgeoning range of sci-fi, or not so sci-fi, cloning, cyborg, AI combo films which push forward new ways to bring about human life, often seemingly from a laboratory setting, glossing swiftly over the fact that new life comes from and is contained in the human female gametes, which are present, traversing generations in the ovaries of the females. Only cloning technologies do not require this female gamete, but are clones new life or just replicants of it. In sci-fi literature, there's a huge amount of work about the creation of life within the universe. Stephen Donaldson's Gap series about a female astronaut and the pregnancies she endures, amongst other horrors, set against alien technologies of forced growing and replication, impacted me greatly as a young adult because it sets the technology in a wider political field. Nothing exists in isolation. Financial inequality is critical to these issues. Otherwise, the new technologies reach only a minute proportion of humanity and remain an elite fantasy. Pregnancy and childbirth are still the biggest killers of women and girls globally today, and perhaps the first issue to be tackled is poverty. Ultrasound for me is very simply a viewing tool and has been so well discussed and described by my colleagues in the Reading Group. It is useful as a diagnostic, but has been adapted into a powerful symbol. The most memorable conversation for me throughout these weeks was in the context of permissions and legalizations, in this case about the right of a woman to abort a malformed fetus, pressurizing the need to keep the child as an act of true and devoted maternal responsibility. So the statement was, and they do somehow combine the unconditional love model with a medicalized one. The response was interesting. Continuing, but that's not what they necessarily want to admit. Response, and it is related to disability rights, and is it related to disability rights at all? And the response was, of course not. They couldn't care less, it's just words. But it's interesting to see how the technocratic view on occasions goes hand in hand with the ultra-Catholic. The ultrasound image of the fetus in its worst case has become another magical symbolic weapon used to control women's autonomy over their reproductive systems, part of their commodification and appropriation. But this is not the fault of the ultrasound, nor the technology. It is how it is used, as with everything else in the world. It is the manner of its use within the system which decides whether it is good or evil, and the context. And it's therefore an aid to examining where and how women are oppressed. Again, perhaps we need to step back and look again at the wider context of women's social and reproductive rights globally. Otherwise, as was said, they couldn't care less. It's just words. From Kendall, she says, the erasure of the maternal body facilitated through the framing of ultrasound images is both a product of and in turn perpetuates the dominant Western conceptual model of pregnancy, which Kingma labels the fetal container model. This model promotes the misleading view of the fetus as an independent subject, perhaps best exemplified by the rise of fetal surgery, of which Anne Draping-Liley and Mary Bridey Mahwold state the pregnant woman is referred to as the uterine environment, or worse yet, as the recovery room or natural incubator for the fetus. Some bioethicists have noted that there's currently a lack of scholarly attention paid to the moral relevance of creating an artificial womb where fetal surgery could be conducted without exposing the pregnant person to medical risk. Again, these are Kendall's words, not mine. She continues, however, the appearance of this artificial womb may further fuel the idea that all gestational locations are merely fetal containers, including inside a person. Given the substantial impact the limited purview of ultrasonography has had on the abortion debate, it is reasonable to assume that without careful consideration, a technology which makes the fetus even more visible might exacerbate this trend. She continues, The Wisdom of Repugnance by Leon Cass claims that feelings of disgust can often stand in for moral intuitions we are unable to articulate. And I have to confess to feeling some repulsion on seeing the unborn XO9 project, which is one of the reasons I wanted to come and join in and check my biases, check my own opinions on it, and see where that stands within a professional context, because it's not my field. Kendall continues that the advent of artificial wombs to require women to have their pregnancies transferred rather than medically terminated would mean forcing women to remain pregnant until the fetus is old enough to be transferred and undergo a major surgical intervention, when they would otherwise simply be able to take medication early in gestation to achieve a termination. A relevant contribution, the increased visibility of fetal development might have here is dispelling myths that ectopic pregnancies can be transferred into the patient uterus, a procedure which is medically impossible and yet legally still debated. To finalize, I am going to keep using Candle because I found it such a brilliant text. Given the significant influence of visual media on how reproductive biotechnologies are treated and understood, this suggests the need for detailed analysis of emerging artificial womb designs from a visual bioethics perspective. And this is where ultrasound is so useful on how we can learn from it, because actually the information provided is highly open to manipulation and very vague. To finish, Kendall states that this technology would allow greater visibility of gestation than ever before, but also highlights the risks that artificial wombs will be used to further restrict women's reproductive liberty and access to abortion. And you've been watching a little film of some of the images and screenshots of the very many gynae horror movies out there. There's a long list of links at the end of this talk. And just once again, huge thanks to Unborn Time Zone 9, the Art Lab team, and Julia Roberts, and the team of readers. And I very much look forward to hearing everyone else's discussions. Thank you very much.
So yeah, this is it. I suggest we now invite Lucy to give some words.
Hi everyone. Good afternoon or whatever, wherever you are. So I'm Lucy. I'm currently in London, but originally from California. And I just wrote some comments out. A lot of my thoughts have been said and a lot of the quotes I pulled out have been quoted. So I'm going to try to just like throw some stuff out and then make it brief. So where was I? I spent this morning rewatching The Silent Scream on YouTube. And I haven't watched that for a really long time. And I actually really like it. I am someone who watched the sonogram while my second abortion was being performed and looked at the fetus that was aborted afterwards. And so I find the premise of the film, if women only knew the truth about what they were doing, if they could only see, rings especially false. And it's interesting because The Silent Scream was released the same year that I was born, which is 1984. So that sort of discourse that sonography and that The Silent Scream had introduced I've sort of been gestated in it my whole life. I think it's interesting to note that even knowing or seeing what they're doing does not dissuade people from doing what they feel they need to do. But I actually agree with Dr. Nathaniel, whatever his name is, the narrator of The Silent Scream, and also Angela Davis and Dorothy Roberts and the Sister Song Women of Justice Collective, Reproductive Justice Collective, and many, many other groups, that abortion can be a really poor solution to what is essentially a social problem. And I just don't believe that not having access to abortion is the solution either.
Performing a sonogram is not very hard. I was trained to do it when I was 21. I used to do gestational dating measurements before abortions, and occasionally I would do inter-op sonogram guidance during abortion procedures under the supervision of the attending doctor. So I find, like any sort of muscle memory skill, you're not perfect at first, but you can certainly get the knack after a bit. So given my own lived experience as a doula, as a staff person at abortion clinics, and also as a community midwife for a while, I particularly was interested in this idea of hacking the sonogram, because I felt like that's sort of what I'd been trying to do in all of my engagements professionally. I'd been engaging with it and also trying to subvert it. So I think the quote from the readings that really stood out to me about as a hack is from the Baton Jones, which is a quote from one of the clients, which was that as soon as I saw it and I saw it move and saw it on the screen and it became more real, I think he thought it would just flip my mind, but it didn't. It kind of confirmed, because if I could still think it when I saw what I saw, to me, that says it was the right decision for me. And I wrote in the group that when I read this, it was like an aha. It was a re-remembering the idea that the pregnant person can see the personhood of the fetus. It could even see it as a separate being through the sonogram, but actually as a confirmation that abortion is the right decision. And so this to me is what feels like hacking the ultrasound. For some pregnant people, they want an abortion because they don't want to attach to a baby, and that is okay. So hacking the ultrasound is making sure that it's offering maybe a confirmation bias as opposed to increasing the cognitive dissonance or anxiety of the person experiencing the technology, which is also, I think, what this article and the Petschke article really point to in its conclusions. I think, so one of the thoughts that I had this morning was I was remembering that many of my clients in the abortion clinic not only wanted to see their sonograms and would ask for a picture, they would also ask for a picture to take home as well as a memento. And I think it's really important to name here that I was working in the United States, where not only do people of color have abortions at much higher rates than white folks, and currently 5 states have legislation in place banning abortion in the case of race selection. Whatever that means, I don't know what it means. It seems like a pretty horrible misconstruction of Dorothy Roberts and Angela Davis and reproductive justice in general. Anyway, a lot of my clients in the abortion clinic were not happy to be there. Most of them were not very happy about needing to enter into a white supremacist coded institution to access their abortions. I worked in a hospital. And they made the staff pretty aware of their feelings, but the clinic that I worked at, we took Medi-Cal and our gestational limit was 24 weeks and 0 days. So sometimes we were people's only option. It was a huge learning for me to learn how to agree with them, to tell them that they were right to be pissed off, but that we would still be here to support whatever they needed that day. And they could be angry, they could be sad, they could be emotional, they could be detached and still have an abortion. A study performed by Answer in 2017 found that 38% of all patients and 61% of interviewees accepted the printout. This is in regards to that printed ultrasound picture. Predictors of accepting the printout included being younger, being non-white, having a partner who is a boyfriend or a friend, and not having a support person at the visit. Interviewees reported that they accepted the printout simply because it was offered out of curiosity or as part of confirming their abortion decision. They described various uses for the printout, including sharing with others, consulting before their abortion appointment, retaining as a keepsake, or nothing at all. And I could potentially propose another reading of non-white people accepting their sonogram printout. I could see this as an example of undercommoning the institution, of reclaiming maybe kinship or moral status to the fetus that Black and brown pregnant people may feel that has essentially been drowned out by the neoliberal pro-choice advocates who to this day beat the dead horse of a bunch of cells, or the rhetoric of anti-abortion advocates who may call those who choose abortion murder. It feels to me that taking home their ultrasound picture in this context may be offering clients the opportunity to express what Ruha Benjamin expresses as Black afterlives matter, cultivating kinfulness as reproductive justice. And I got that from Making Kin, Not Population, which is another Donna Haraway and Adele Clark publication. So then I did pull out another Sophie Lewis quote about killing, and from her work in Free Ectogenesis, Anti-Work Abortion. But this is already sort of the Sophie Lewis fan club. We could rename this reading group. So maybe I'll just pause there. I have a little bit more, but that's about 10 minutes. So.
Maybe we go for the group discussion. Maybe Julie, you want to reflect on this? I mean, I was happy to hear that some books have been also really influential for student me, such as or texts like Rosalind Peczynski or Sophie Lewis, also going to be quite an important read for the next group of Surrogacy, but for sure. But maybe Julie can now take maybe comments. And
I just want to say, first of all, just thank you to all our readers who have engaged so deeply with the reading list, and I have to say added to the reading list enormously. So I don't know if it will be available somewhere, Evan, but you know, I started our list before the reading group, but certainly I've added a lot to it based on the things that people were interested in, and all of our readers who are here today have added to it as well. So it's been very much a collaborative effort and has become much more wide-ranging and interesting as a result. So definitely I would recommend checking that out. And I just want to say thank you as well for so generously sharing your thoughts, your feelings, your experiences. It's been really valuable, I think, to have those things woven into your responses to the reading. And we've had this really wide range of presentations, haven't we, from sort of ethnography in the clinic and sort of we might call autoethnography to film, looking at film studies and film, the images in film. I think, I guess what jumps out to me in terms of the connections, and I hope you'll have things that you want to say to each other, but I think there's a common theme around agency, certainly. And I think it's really important that you're starting to question the way that agency has been talked about in relation to ultrasound in the feminist literature so far. I think it's really good to see people starting to think about challenging that or building on it or taking it in new directions. So that's really interesting. I think there's a commonality around kind of commodification and our sort of ambivalences about that. And there's a lot of interest in the idea of hacking, which has been great actually to think not just kind of backwards, but kind of to think into the future in terms of can we hack this technology in a sort of feminist sense. And you know, Evan's Echo Pen project has kind of really got us thinking, I think, in terms of to what extent are any of those social and ethical issues inevitably kind of built into the technology, or will they carry any of these same problematic kind of issues with it if you can hold it in your hand and take it anywhere? Do those sort of social, ethical, moral dilemmas go with it, or is it very context specific. So, I would like to just kind of open it up to the readers to see if you'd like to kind of respond to each other. Did you see commonalities, things that kind of made you think? Does anyone want to be brave?
I just wanted to say to Lucy that I really like this idea of hacking being simply resisting the situation in which you are kind of culturally forced to assume a specific view of ultrasound, and you kind of go against it no matter in what situation and how, but nevertheless, you have this liberty. And I'm not sure how to even, because like with hacking, I had immediately the association of like some kind of hardware, software things, and some really dealing with technology and do-it-yourself stuff. And you just said that it's enough to think something different than everyone else in the room thinks, and have different feelings, and allow yourself to have different feelings than those that are generally accepted, socially accepted. I think it's very powerful. I don't know what to do with this right now, but just for a start.
Thanks. Yeah, I just sort of thought about it. I thought about it in relation to like making kin, not population, and Ruha Benjamin's work in particular just this morning. So I don't totally feel like it's a very developed thought. And I've also, I think it really depends on how we identify hacking. I know Julie and I had a conversation during the reading group, because I was remembering in the US, we had mandated vaginal ultrasound law, I think in Virginia, and this was like in 2012. And a lot of the pro-choice rhetoric at that time was around that they were calling vaginal ultrasound or as like rape, or they, and for me, as somebody who was working in the clinic at the time and saw many vaginal ultrasounds being performed, I started to worry about my clients who would come in and maybe would need to interact with that technology. But all of a sudden, the discourse sort of had been hacked by the right wing, I would say. And so, that was just another, like, that's the thing about, I guess, situated knowledge, or, that sort of idea of, we always have the potential to hack it, but it can be limited given the discourses that have been introduced. So I don't know, I'm still sort of playing with it, I suppose. It's
probably it gives more space for all kind of grassroots initiatives that are not necessarily, again, like this very straightforwardly medical assistance you might get with your pregnancy or abortion or whatever medical gynecological needs you might have, but simply let you prepare yourself for having this kind of assistance wherever else, but empower you to go there with your ideas and be more resistant to whatever discourse they are going to sell you or give you or preach to you, which is also a very, very, very good thing, because I've seen women doing this in all kind of internet, Facebook groups where they are looking for doctors and recommend to each other clinics or whatever, and they just say, I have this and this problem, I'm going to visit a doctor, but I need your empowerment in order to be better prepared. And this is also kind of, community hacking.
I guess Evan's echo, or the hacking that Evan's doing is about affordability, from what I understand. That's how Evan, obviously you know more than me, but that's how it's been framed. It's about people being able to access the technology in places where it might not otherwise be financially viable. So I feel like that was one way that we thought about hacking, but mainly it seems to have been about context, as you just said.
It's about access for sure, bringing access, but it's affordability is one thing, but the access to the technology in countries where there is no actual ultrasound imaging that is portable cheap device that can be taken in medical desert or in places remote, especially in let's say, I mean, Ectogen has been a lot working with African countries where they have very limited access to ultrasound imaging. So I always thought it is already quite an interesting, the question of access for me is important. In terms of hacking, or what I see also is this, if this device come more common in use, it will have also an impact on the self-help communities, and that will create a lot of internal discussion in the hospital project, the Ectogen project. That's how they will position themselves when it's question of, I don't know, countries where abortion is illegal, is used in self-help context, or countries where you actually have limited access to social security, and then you rely a lot on self-help. And we had this discussion during the reading groups about the gene-punk groups, for instance, who actually reflect on that, like especially started in Spain, where they didn't have much access to social security. So how do this medical community developing the device? Now they are going to certification, and they will have these issues to position themselves. That's also at what level they're going to hack that. And I don't really have an answer. It has to come from the doctors somehow, or the engineers.
Yeah, I think it's been really helpful to have that.
Sorry,
I think it's been really helpful to have that project in mind alongside the reading, because you know, I know that the sort of disciplines where I'm coming from, I've been very influenced by that medicalization kind of critique, and you know, but actually your project makes, I think we had some conversations, didn't we, about what feminist hacking would be, and actually given all this literature is making ultrasound more available. Is that a good thing? But of course, you know, it has some of those kind of clinical benefits. So I think it's about being aware of what kind of things might follow. And it made me think about scale, because as I said, I think, you know, commercial scans were only possible when the machinery got small enough to put in the back of a car or to carry in a briefcase, right? And now we're talking about it being handheld. And what does that do to the way that the technology is used, and what are the kind of social and ethical issues that might come along with it in different contexts?
Also, scale in terms of in a commercial or in any ultrasound clinic where you're being scanned, the screen is often bigger than the body that's being scanned. Whereas if it's on an iPhone and it's small, an iPhone's or a smartphone or whatever it is these technologies that are sort of now increasingly just extensions of ourselves. What does that do to have the image and something that you can hold? Does that change, for talking about like agency and personhood, does that affect that?
Yeah, I was really struck by that, Holly, in your talk, because I you know, I saw that in my fieldwork as well, when you're sort of projecting this enormous image onto the wall, that some women could be quite unsettled by that kind of, well, how big is this baby? And you know, and especially if that then, you know, if the position doesn't reflect what you think you can feel, and those kind of things that are quite quite unsettling. But yeah, that's interesting. And what if it's something that you can hold in your hand? I suppose in a way the take-home images are that, aren't they, that you can, that kind of, or the mug.
You know, one of the things, and I don't know, Holly, I really appreciated the BBC clip you shared about the commercial ultrasounds and the sort of BBC expose. And what it really made me think about was how a lot of folks were putting maybe sort of a inflated sense of trust in these commercial ultrasounds, right? And that was really mediated maybe by capitalism, by paying for something that they were imagining was both for comfort and also a diagnostic tool. And then it was missing the diagnostics. And sort of misidentifying the sonographer as the professional who would be able to like notice something like anencephaly or what was the other one, was an ectopic pregnancy. And yeah, I'm wondering, what I love about the idea of it being on the sonogram is like, how would that like, how that, I guess it's biopower, right? How would that change if the person doing it is a partner or like a friend or a sibling, or, you know, you don't expect your sibling to know necessarily to diagnose anencephaly. And so then it sort of changes the way that having open access without that like capitalism, that capitalist piece of paying for it, maybe changes those dynamics. So that also seems like hacking it is making it so available that it sort of loses that misconstruction of the sonographer as somebody who has power over or more information about your own body than you do as the person experiencing the sonogram.
And there was a tension in the stuff that we've read about the sort of feminist, the historical feminist literature arguing that it's potentially an alienating technology and that fetal personhood is given value over maternal personhood. But then actually the experience of people sometimes in these clinics was pleasure, and the word pleasure has come up quite a lot, which sort of, I don't know, complicates these older feminist discourses. And maybe if it became freely available and open source and anyone could use it, pleasure would be something that would come up more often. I guess it may be in sort of line with Matilda's stuff on authorship, in terms of using it in a different way, like in not using it for diagnosis or medical stuff or for bonding, but I don't know, to create images, or I don't know, maybe it wouldn't know either. Like pleasure in both maybe the potential future baby or in the abortion as well, like.
Or what about pleasure in, I had this idea, it's a little, but like maybe it could be an art installation, so it wouldn't be crass, but what if the transvaginal ultrasound was also a sex toy or something, you know? I mean, talk about pleasure, talk about kind of like hacking the technology or like blurring the boundaries, because it is something that's going intervaginally, right? Like what, we try to make that clinical, but most of the time that's depicted in the world, it is not a clinical act. So I don't know.
Excuse me, I have two footnotes. One to what just Lucy said. There is such a scene in a TV show in Working Moms. It's a Canadian TV show, I think available on Netflix, and it's actually shown as a transvaginal ultrasound that is a sex scene, and the man who is performing is a technician, so he is like a medical professional, but nevertheless it happens. And yeah, so for like film recommendations, it's already there as an idea of, you know, like a sexual pleasure, but and I think that like Working Moms, in terms of like what they show, they push the boundary quite far. But coming back to the another footnote to what Holly said, the problem with pleasure is that I think at least part of this pleasurable experiences that women report to be having, including Sharon Lehner, I think is partly because like, I think she's like aware of this, is that you are doing exactly what the things that society kind of expects you to be doing. That here it is, you're a good mother, this is your baby, the baby is healthy, and you're going to give birth to a healthy baby, and so everything is fine. And so it's a pleasure, right? I mean, and to the more, this is like the official pleasure, the one that is promised by this experience in a, you know, classical, let's say, pregnancy ultrasound. This is something that you subscribe to when you go to the clinic in order to get your ultrasound. And the fact that all the measurements that the doctors do show that you're going to give birth to a healthy baby, that the fetus is healthy. This is the source of pleasure, but it's exactly the ambiguous part. So, and also the part that you kind of, the theories criticize or discuss, because it's very problematic for all the reasons that we kind of named before.
I guess, yeah, you're failing if you go into your scan and you don't experience pleasure. You're not doing a good job.
Exactly, yeah.
Something's
Yeah,
gone
yeah.
wrong.
Or it means that something's wrong, right?
Yeah.
You're not experiencing pleasure because something's wrong. So it's like the reverse of what's supposed to be.
I suppose in the text that we were looking at, the pleasure was coming maybe with these scans for abortion, where it was unexpected or not something that we're meant to experience when we have abortions. Yeah.
Again, I think that women's reactions to, or their responses to seeing ultrasound images of their own bodies are very much prescribed, aren't they? We're supposed to react in a particular way. Interested, but not too interested in taking a picture home, but, you know, yeah, the right level of interest in the right aspects of the scan, I think.
Janelle Taylor as well, right? When people are too keen to know the gender, or so it means that they don't treat it seriously enough. And so they are punished by a doctor or a technician by withdrawing certain privileges, like giving a picture or something, because they are not serious enough. Yeah. And
a sonographer I spoke to once this was like just after COVID, and she was disgruntled at the way in which people were using her. She was working for the NHS, the way in which people were using the service. So so it's talking about like people coming in with popcorn and their kids to watch the ultrasound scan, and she really didn't feel like that's what it was for. And she was very against 4D ultrasound commercial clinics because they take away the importance of the diagnostic test and the medicalization of it, and it's not for pleasure. And there is like this there's like a constant tensions going on about how you're meant to experience this technology. So it also depends on the setting, like whether or not you're in a medical setting or you're in an entertainment setting. And the experience that we had in these 3D commercial clinics was it was very spa-like. You were like paying a lot of money to come and experience this. It was like a luxury.
Yeah.
But there was,
and also there are fewer rules, right? So you can bring more people and you can respond in slightly different ways, perhaps. Yeah. But listen to the language. This is so kind of, yeah, people bringing popcorn and their kids. Sally's got a hand up.
Yeah, no, I was just remembering going with my very good friend to her 4D scan with another friend, and it ended up, the other friend that came with us was Pakistani, and there was an Indian sonographer, and it ended up in a huge political fight. And we had to put our third person out of the room and that's partly because it was such an informal, we were paying, it was being paid for, it was informal. That would never have happened in a formal medical setting. So there are lots of lines being crossed, on lots of social boundaries being crossed in those scan environments. But I think with the reading group, I think there's so much that we discussed that we haven't had time to discuss today. And I found the conversations absolutely brilliant. Sorry to quote Matilda, you and Lucy as well. I think I stole from you both. But yeah, when I focused in on the images of pregnancy and ultrasound in film, and the gynae horror came, I was shocked because I don't watch a lot of gynae horror on purpose. I don't go out looking. But that whole two-way street between popular culture and medical culture, we're just swamped with it. We're absolutely swamped with it. And actually, the overwhelming amount of imagery, especially the sci-fi imagery, is very negative in lots of ways towards the medical. It's not perhaps what you'd expect. But there aren't any, I couldn't find any outside of sort of soap situations, films of wildly natural pregnancy, wildly wonderful pregnancy. It's just portrayed as a horrific initiation, which then is quite often medicalized or science fictionalized. So I was wondering about the psychological impact on women and their expectations created by all of that.
I don't think we know, but as you say, the influences perhaps are going both ways, and partly how women know how to come into the room and position themselves and how they should be feeling and responding. Is, you know, we see that in popular culture as well as.
And again, Holly's bringing in the word trust. I mean, the amount of trust we have in our medical practice is, again, hugely variable and very, very demographic specific. So the context is always.
Yeah.
And I was really moved today, Lucy, by you speaking about it. So thank you, because it's obviously talking about it is one thing, doing it's another, and you've done it, and you've done an amazing job. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm shocked to find it's 7 o'clock already. I feel we could. Regina, are we due to finish at 7, aren't we?
No, it's been 2 hours, true.
Yeah. But as Sally says, I think we've had such wide-ranging discussions over this month, and so summing it up in a couple of hours is difficult. But I think everyone's done a great job of pulling out what's kind of interesting to them and what's been most striking, and kind of weaving together some of them reflections on the reading, personal experience, your own research, and so on. And it's been really interesting to hear the point you're at now, 4 weeks in. Evan, do you have some final?
Yeah, well, thank you, everyone. It's been really nice to hear all this discussion. I've been reading also the chat closely today, and it's been really a while. It's also many discussion we had on the ongoing research. You know, we said Shuli and me, we had this idea we have a group called Future Baby Production, because at some point it was a collective project. We wanted to put in the front this idea of the collective, and so many discussions and so many inputs, and so that's part of our vision of how we had to go through this project. And I'm really glad we could have these discussions, and today as well. And Sally video was also quite fascinating. So thank you so much. Some of the discussion also open from our next reading group. I hope some of you can also join that one. It's going to be in the fall. We have been hearing a lot about Sophie Lewis, and of course our book Surrogacy now has also been quite an influential reading for us with Shuli. And Shuli couldn't make it today. She's on the other side of the world in the desert. And but she, of course, she joined me on that. And I hope in the fall you can join this surrogacy discussion, because of course from ultrasound to ectogenesis, and going through reading Sophie Lewis, for instance, all this, like we're talking about communal gestation, and all these political issues are also very interesting. So we really want to also go that direction in the fall. Yeah, so hopefully you can also join. Maybe Regina, you have a comment on that, how it's going to be organized, the next session in the fall?
Yes, actually, we have said that we have it in from the middle of October to the middle of November. So I guess in the early October, we're going to have an open call for the third reading group Surrogacy. And we will start the 16th of October and with the reading group leader and the participants. And then around 18th of November, but we still have to confirm that, we're going to have another live stream like we had today. And we had in the 27th of May with Ectogenesis. So I guess that's what we can actually predict. And of course, everyone from the previous reading groups is very welcome to join us. And I really liked the contributions today. So for my part, maybe I can also to finish the event. We from Art Laboratory Berlin, we really want to thank Julie Roberts very much for guiding the reading group so eloquently. And we have a lot of applause here, I see. And also thank you so much, Sally, Holly, Lucy, Matilda, for joining and very openly sharing with us your knowledge, your research, and also your personal stories. I think the whole audience here with us, and also those who will hear it in the future, because we recorded it and we put it online, and it is 24/7 unlimited available. So I think our audience will treasure a lot the openness and sharing knowledge. This is actually our ethos at Art Laboratory Berlin in general. So yeah, actually, so just to wrap it up here, out there and inside, actually, thank you all again for having a collective thought and a collectively sharing ideas, critically ideas in an open manner, and hopefully meet you all soon in Berlin at Art Laboratory Berlin's events on site, and then also welcome also on our online discursive formats that we also have in the future. So maybe right now we say goodbye and say